Hello everyone, and welcome to my Young and the Restless official 24 channel. Victor Newman's death in 2026 does not arrive like a quiet candle flickering out in the night. It detonates across Genoa City like an earthquake that cracks foundations, shatters alliances, and forces every powerful family to confront a future they never truly believed would come. Because Victor Newman was never supposed to die, he was supposed to outlive his enemies, his children's doubts, his rivals' schemes, and even time itself. Yet when the unthinkable finally happens, the city feels hollowed out, as though its spine has been ripped away, and in the stunned silence that follows the announcement of his passing, one truth becomes impossible to ignore: an era has ended, and the war for Newman Enterprises has only just begun, because Victor's final days were not marked by peace or reconciliation but by one last, ruthless chess match in which he positioned his pieces with chilling precision, knowing full well that death was approaching and that his legacy would either stand unchallenged or be claimed by the one rival he respected, despised, and feared in equal measure, Jack Abbott. For years, Victor had insisted that Newman Enterprises could survive anything so long as a Newman sat at the helm, but his final machinations reveal a darker, more complex truth, one that stuns Nicky, devastates Victoria, enrages Nick, and leaves Adam spiraling. Victor did not trust his children to protect his empire from Jack, and in the cruel irony that defines his life, Victor's last move ensures that Jack Abbott becomes the new king of Newman Enterprises, not through theft or trickery, but through a legal, airtight transfer of power that Victor himself orchestrated, leaving behind a corporate coup so monumental it rewrites Genoa City history. The signs were there long before Victor's death: subtle shifts in board votes, mysterious shell companies quietly acquiring Newman stock, whispered rumors of a secret trust established years earlier, but no one dared to believe the conclusion those clues pointed toward, because admitting it would mean admitting that Victor Newman had accepted his mortality and chosen Jack Abbott as his successor, a notion that feels sacrilegious to the Newman family, especially Victoria, who had spent her entire life grooming herself to inherit the throne only to discover that her father never truly let go of his belief that blood alone was not enough to rule, and that the ruthless clarity Jack possessed, the ability to win without sentiment, made him the only man Victor trusted to protect Newman Enterprises from destruction, even if that protection came at the cost of Newman pride. As Victor's health declines in secret, he summons Jack under the guise of one last truce, their meeting heavy with decades of hatred, betrayal, and begrudging respect, and though the conversation appears on the surface to be nothing more than two aging titans trading barbs, it is in fact a negotiation of legacy, with Victor testing Jack's resolve, probing his willingness to make impossible decisions, and gauging whether Jack would put the company above personal vendettas. And when Jack passes every test, not with arrogance, but with cold-eyed realism, Victor makes his choice, drafting documents that will only activate upon his death, transferring controlling interest of Newman Enterprises into a blind trust with Jack Abbott named as executor and interim CEO, a move designed to prevent corporate chaos, fend off hostile takeovers, and ensure that the company survives the storm that Victor knows will follow his passing. When Victor finally dies, the shock is immediate and visceral: Nicky collapsing under the weight of grief and unfinished business, Nick drowning in rage at all the words left unsaid, Adam haunted by the realization that no matter how hard he fought for approval, he was never truly free of his father's manipulations, and Victoria standing frozen as the truth sinks in that everything she believed about her destiny has been ripped away. Because the reading of Victor's will does not merely divide assets, it exposes the final judgment of a man who ruled through fear and foresight. And when Jack Abbott's name is spoken as the man entrusted with Newman Enterprises, the room erupts, accusations flying, voices breaking, and decades of family loyalty igniting into open war. Yet the legal reality is inescapable, the documents unassailable, and Jack's control absolute. Jack himself is not triumphant in the way many expect. There is no smirk, no victory speech, only a solemn understanding of the burden Victor has placed on his shoulders, because taking control of Newman Enterprises is not a conquest but a reckoning, forcing Jack to step into the shadow of the man who defined his life as an enemy, and in doing so, to confront his own demons, his past failures, and the lingering question of whether he has become too much like Victor to recognize where the line between power and obsession truly lies. Genoa City reels as the corporate landscape shifts overnight, with executives scrambling to pledge loyalty, rivals plotting their next moves, and the Abbott family divided over Jack's decision to accept the role, Billy torn between pride and resentment, Diane wary of the enemies Jack is inviting into their lives, and Ashley quietly wondering whether this victory will ultimately cost Jack everything he has fought to rebuild. While at Newman Enterprises, the employees walk through halls that still echo with Victor's presence, unsure whether Jack's leadership will bring stability or ignite a civil war within the company. Jack's first acts as ruler are decisive and shocking. He freezes certain accounts, restructures divisions that Victor used as weapons against his own children, and makes it clear that sentimentality will not dictate his choices, earning him both admiration and fury, particularly from Victoria, who sees every move as an insult to her father's legacy, and from Adam, who recognizes the same ruthless efficiency he once tried to emulate, only now wielded by the man Victor ultimately chose over his own son. The psychological fallout is just as devastating as the corporate upheaval, as Nikki grapples with the realization that the man she loved engineered chaos as his final gift. Nick questions whether loyalty to a name is worth sacrificing his own moral compass, and Victoria descends into a dangerous obsession with reclaiming what she believes is rightfully hers. Setting the stage for a Newman versus Abbott war more personal and explosive than anything that came before, because this is no longer about business, it is about identity, betrayal, and the terrifying truth that Victor Newman's influence did not die with him but instead tightened its grip from beyond the grave. As Jack settles into his role, he is haunted by Victor's voice, by the knowledge that every decision he makes will be measured against the impossible standard of a man who ruled through intimidation and fear. And yet there are moments, quiet, unguarded moments, when Jack realizes that Victor's final move was not purely strategic but deeply personal, a twisted acknowledgement that Jack was the only one strong enough to do what Victor himself could no longer do. Let go, adapt, and ensure survival at any cost. The city watches, waiting for Jack to fail, for the Newman family to tear him apart, for the empire to crumble under the weight of its own mythology, but instead, Newman Enterprises stabilizes, profits rise, and Jack's leadership proves effective, forcing everyone to confront the uncomfortable possibility that Victor was right, that his greatest rival was also his greatest legacy, and that the line between enemy and heir was always thinner than anyone dared to admit. Still, victory is never clean in Genoa City, and as secrets about Victor's final days continue to surface, hidden clauses, whispered confessions, and evidence that he may have anticipated every reaction from beyond the grave, the sense of unease grows, because if Victor Newman could control the future even in death, then no one is truly free of his shadow, not Jack Abbott, not the Newman children, and not the empire that bears his name, making Victor's death not an ending, but a transformation, a passing of the torch forged in rivalry and sealed in betrayal, marking the end of one era and the brutal birth of another, where Jack Abbott sits on the throne of Newman Enterprises not as a conqueror celebrating his triumph, but as a ruler bound by the final will of the man who defined him, carrying forward a legacy that will forever blur the line between victory and loss, love and war, and power and the price it demands. As the dust settles from Jack Abbott's unprecedented rise to the top of Newman Enterprises, the illusion of stability begins to crack, revealing the deeper, far more dangerous consequences of Victor Newman's final move. Because while the numbers on the balance sheets improve and the markets respond favorably to Jack's decisive leadership, the emotional and psychological war ignited by Victor's death rages uncontrollably beneath the surface, threatening to consume everyone caught in its path. Starting with Victoria Newman, whose grief mutates into fury as she becomes obsessed with proving that her father was manipulated, coerced, or betrayed into naming Jack his successor, and this obsession drives her to dig relentlessly into Victor's final months, scrutinizing every signature, every witness, every legal maneuver, convinced that somewhere in the labyrinth of paperwork lies the key to undoing Jack's reign. Nick, meanwhile, finds himself pulled in two opposing directions, torn between loyalty to his sister's crusade and a growing realization that Jack's leadership, while brutal in its clarity, is saving the company from the very self-destruction Victor feared, a realization that fills Nick with guilt so intense it borders on self-loathing, because admitting Jack's competence feels like betraying his father all over again, even as Adam watches from the shadows with a bitter, knowing smile, recognizing that this outcome is the purest expression of Victor Newman's worldview, one in which love is conditional, power is everything, and the ultimate compliment is trust bestowed upon a rival rather than a son, Adam's resentment does not explode outward. Instead, it calcifies into something far more dangerous, a quiet patience as he studies Jack's strategies, learns his rhythms, and begins to consider whether the empire his father handed to Jack might one day be taken again by someone who understands Victor's lessons better than anyone else ever could. Nikki's grief takes on a different form, less explosive but no less destructive, as she becomes consumed by memories of Victor's final days, questioning every tender moment, every whispered promise, wondering whether she was a wife or merely another piece on his board, and this doubt corrodes her sense of self until she confronts Jack directly, demanding to know what Victor truly said to him in their last meeting. A confrontation that strips away Jack's armor as he admits that Victor did not speak of love or forgiveness, but of survival, of the inevitability of chaos, and of his certainty that only Jack Abbott could prevent Newman Enterprises from becoming a battlefield that would destroy his children completely, a confession that leaves Nikki shattered, forced to face the unbearable truth that the man she loved trusted his enemy more than his own family. As weeks turn into months, Jack's rule becomes more assertive, more transformative, as he dismantles divisions Victor deliberately kept at odds, cuts loose executives who thrived under fear, and restructures Newman Enterprises into a machine built for longevity rather than domination, earning him fierce resistance from those still loyal to Victor's way of doing business. And it is in this resistance that Victoria finds her opening, aligning herself with disgruntled board members and old Newman loyalists to launch a covert campaign against Jack, leaking damaging narratives to the press, questioning his authority, and framing every success as a betrayal of Victor's legacy, a narrative that resonates deeply with a public still mourning the titan who defined an era. Jack, however, anticipated this resistance, and his response is calculated and devastating, as he releases a sealed letter Victor left behind, addressed to the board and the Newman family alike, in which Victor explicitly states that Jack's control is not temporary, not symbolic, but essential, and that any attempt to undermine him would be an act of self-sabotage, a final, unmistakable command from beyond the grave that silences the board and leaves Victoria publicly humiliated, her authority weakened at the very moment she believed victory was within reach. The release of the letter sends shockwaves through Genoa City, not only because of its contents but because of its tone, cold and unsentimental, devoid of affection, laying bare Victor's belief that legacy is earned through strength alone, a belief that forces every Newman to confront the possibility that they were never heirs in the way they imagined, but merely participants in Victor's ongoing war against weakness. Jack, increasingly isolated by the weight of his position, finds unexpected understanding in Diane, who recognizes the toll this victory is taking on him. The way Victor's voice seems to echo in every boardroom decision, every late-night strategy session, every ruthless choice Jack makes in the name of stability, and Diane's fear grows that Jack is losing himself to a role that was never truly his, becoming a custodian of another man's empire rather than the architect of his own future. Billy, watching his brother transform into something colder and more distant, lashes out, accusing Jack of becoming Victor Newman in all but name, an accusation that cuts deeper than any corporate attack, because Jack knows there is truth in it, that ruling Newman Enterprises requires a level of emotional detachment he once swore he would never embrace, and yet stepping away now would mean letting Victor's carefully constructed legacy collapse into chaos, a responsibility Jack cannot bring himself to abandon. As tensions escalate, Adam makes his move, quietly acquiring influence within subsidiaries Jack overlooked, positioning himself as a stabilizing force to executives unsettled by Jack's reforms, presenting himself not as Victor's son seeking vengeance but as a visionary offering continuity. And when Jack finally realizes the scope of Adam's maneuvering, he sees in it the same brilliance Victor once wielded, a realization that both terrifies and impresses him, because it confirms Victor's ultimate tragedy, that the son most like him was the one he could never truly embrace. The confrontation between Jack and Adam is inevitable and explosive, a battle of minds rather than fists, as Adam accuses Jack of stealing a throne built on blood and betrayal, while Jack counters that Victor chose him precisely because Adam was too consumed by his need for approval to ever escape Victor's shadow, words that land with devastating precision and push Adam to a breaking point, forcing him to choose between repeating his father's cycle or forging a new path that does not require destroying Jack to feel whole. Meanwhile, Victoria's obsession reaches a dangerous crescendo as she uncovers evidence that Victor manipulated her failures to justify his decision, deliberately undermining her at critical moments to reinforce his belief that she was unfit to rule, a discovery that devastates her more deeply than Jack's takeover ever could, because it reveals that her greatest obstacle was never Jack Abbott but her own father, and this realization fractures her resolve, leaving her to question whether reclaiming Newman Enterprises would truly honor Victor or merely perpetuate the abuse disguised as legacy. Genoa City becomes a pressure cooker of unresolved grief and ambition, as alliances shift, old wounds reopen, and the line between personal and corporate warfare dissolves completely, culminating in a public showdown at the annual Newman Enterprises Summit, where Jack stands before shareholders, employees, and the Newman family to deliver a speech that was never part of Victor's plan, a speech that acknowledges Victor's genius and cruelty in equal measure, that honors his achievements without excusing the damage he inflicted, and that declares a future for Newman Enterprises that is not bound to one man's fear of weakness, a future that prioritizes sustainability over domination, integrity over intimidation, a future that dares to evolve. The reaction is polarizing and immediate, with some hailing Jack as the leader Newman Enterprises desperately needs, while others see his words as the ultimate betrayal. But for the first time since Victor's death, the conversation shifts from who should rule to what kind of empire should exist, a shift that signals the true end of Victor Newman's era, not because his influence has vanished, but because it is finally being questioned openly. In the aftermath, Jack understands that his ultimate victory is not control of Newman Enterprises but the courage to redefine it, even if doing so means alienating those who can never forgive him for surviving Victor Newman. And as he looks out over a city still haunted by the man who once ruled it, Jack Abbott accepts the brutal truth that power never truly belongs to anyone, that it is borrowed, contested, and ultimately transient, and that Victor Newman's greatest legacy was not an empire or a name, but the ruthless clarity he forced upon those who followed him, a clarity Jack now carries forward not as a conqueror, but as a man determined to ensure that the end of one era becomes the beginning of something stronger, wiser, and finally free from the shadow of fear that defined it for so long. The fragile calm that follows Jack Abbott's bold redefinition of Newman Enterprises proves to be nothing more than the deep breath before another storm, because Genoa City has never been a place where power quietly settles, and Victor Newman's shadow refuses to loosen its grip without one final reckoning that forces every character to confront not just what was lost, but who they have become in the aftermath of his death. In the weeks following the summit, Jack finds himself walking a razor's edge, praised publicly as a visionary while privately navigating an endless maze of sabotage, loyalty tests, and emotional landmines left behind by Victor's long reign. And though the company continues to thrive on paper, the human cost of this transformation becomes impossible to ignore as longtime employees struggle to adapt to a culture no longer ruled by fear, while others actively resist it, clinging to the comfort of Victor's authoritarian certainty even as it poisoned them. Jack's nights grow restless, haunted by dreams in which Victor sits across from him in the boardroom, silent but watchful, as though waiting to see whether Jack will ultimately prove worthy of the trust he never wanted but cannot escape. And this psychological toll begins to strain Jack's relationships, particularly with Diane, who senses that Jack's identity is slowly dissolving into the role Victor designed for him, a vessel to carry forward an empire that was never meant to be gentle, even as Jack insists that change takes time and sacrifice, that revolutions are never painless, and that walking away now would mean abandoning Newman Enterprises to the very darkness Victor feared most. Across town, Victoria's unraveling becomes more visible and more dangerous, as the discovery of Victor's deliberate manipulation of her career detonates her sense of self-worth, leaving her oscillating between cold calculation and raw despair. And while she publicly retreats from the battlefield, claiming exhaustion and a need for distance, privately she begins assembling a dossier of Victor's secrets, financial, personal, and psychological, not to destroy Jack, but to expose the myth of Victor Newman once and for all, believing that if the city truly understood the cost of his legacy, they would reject the empire he built and the successor he chose. Nick, caught between compassion for his sister and a growing respect for Jack's attempts at reform, becomes the reluctant mediator, urging Victoria to step back before she burns every bridge she has left, while simultaneously confronting Jack about the emotional wreckage left in his wake. A confrontation that forces Jack to acknowledge that even well-intentioned power can devastate those who were raised to believe it was their birthright, and though Jack offers Nick a role within the company, one designed to give the Newmans a voice without undermining stability, Nick hesitates, fearful that accepting would make him complicit in erasing his father, yet terrified that refusing would mean surrendering the future to forces even more ruthless than Jack Abbott. Adam, watching these fractures deepen, senses opportunity but also danger, as his growing influence within Newman subsidiaries draws the attention of old enemies and new allies alike, and though he tells himself that his goal is balance, not domination, the thrill of control awakens instincts he has spent years trying to suppress, leading him to orchestrate